Okay, morning everyone. Excited to be talking about OWASP Amass today. Now, this is a tool that I personally really like. So yeah, I'm stoked to be kind of sharing a little bit about this tool. Hopefully you can get some good value out of this. Now, unfortunately, I am not able to make it into the conference in person to give this talk. I'm currently isolating with COVID. So that's a bit of a shame, but hey, sometimes it'd be like that. So it's all good. We'll just crack on anyway. Start with a little bit about me. So, hey, I'm Kento, a security analyst at Westpac here in Auckland, and I've got a cyber nerd, sports nerd, and meme nerd. That pretty much sums me up. Like I have about 3 brain cells in total, and each of those brain cells is assigned to one of these 3 things. So, so yeah, that's pretty much me. Now, before I get fully into it, I do want to just quickly shout out all the sponsors for the conference this year. I really enjoy OWASP Day every year, and it's these people that can make that happen for us. So thank you for the ongoing support, and thank you to the team who worked so hard organizing this conference also. Okay, I'll just go over the schedule, the agenda for today. It's a pretty straightforward sort of format, I think. I'll start by kind of talking about what Amass actually is, give a bit of an overview, a bit of a background into the tool. Then I'll talk a little bit about how you can actually use Amass. So this might be something that you can actually take away and use maybe later, like, at home for yourself. So we'll discuss the features of Amass, and how you can go about using them. Then I'll give a case as to sort of why I think Amass is so useful and so valuable, whether that be just for your own personal usage or for like an enterprise organization setting. And then finally, I'll just wrap the whole thing up with a bit of a case study, a bit of an example about how we used Amass at Westpac during one of our response items to the Log4j vulnerability. And that should hopefully just tie this whole thing together and really illustrate, like why Amass is so useful, and how you could actually go about using that too. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about Amass itself. So this is an OWASP flagship project. First started in around 2018, which makes it about 4 years old now. It's run by 2 people named Jeff Foley and Anthony Rhodes. So shout outs to them. And they actually maintain a really active community around this tool as well. They have a Discord server, so you can actually jump in the Discord server, and the whole OWASP Amass team are in there. And they're very, very responsive actually to maybe troubleshoot any issues that you're having, or take any feature requests, that kind of thing. Got here that I think it's an underrated OWASP project. Maybe when people think about OWASP projects, they'll think about the top 10 or the SAM or zproxy, those kind of things. But Mass has been around for a few years now, and I think it's actually really, really effective. And obviously it's open source, so you can use it for free. The only thing I would say though is that probably in the bug bounty space in particular, Amass does have a good amount of hype and is frequently used there. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is later on. But what does Amass actually do, right? Like what is the point of this tool? Well, this is the definition that is provided on the OWASP website. It says a tool to help information security professionals perform network mapping of attack surfaces and perform external asset discovery using open source information gathering and active reconnaissance techniques. Now, that is a bit of a mouthful, to say the least, like lots of technical jargon in there and like literally no punctuation. So I've done my best to sort of simplify this one down even further. And this is kind of what that looks like. So I've got show stuff on the internet using scanning techniques. Um, so essentially this is what Amass does, right? Like it'll use scanning techniques to show the stuff that exists on the internet for a specific organization. What do I mean by this even further? Well, essentially, like organizations have stuff on the internet. Now, saying stuff might be a bit of a crude way to put it. Probably the word assets is the more acceptable terminology for this, but you could also use other phrases like resources, devices, things. But the reality is that organizations will have things on the internet that are publicly accessible. They could be websites, applications, IoT maybe, various bits of network infrastructure, or databases, those kind of things. And for most organizations, that's out of necessity, right? Like they need to have assets on the internet in order for their company to function. And for most larger or older organizations, it's more likely that there will be a lot of different assets that sit on the internet and are accessible. So a mass is really a tool purpose-made to kind of show us all these assets, give us a map of them all, and really kind of help with that asset management aspect of information security. And it does that through, like it says, open source information gathering and some active reconnaissance techniques, which we'll get into a little bit later. Okay, so let's actually talk about how you can use a mass and some of the features that it has, and what those features might look like with some example outputs of them. This is what mass actually looks like from a sort of, it's a command line tool. So when you actually install it and run it from the command line, you get that kind of obligatory ASCII art. There's some information in here, like some help info, but really I would kind of give a shout out to the GitHub documentation that exists for a mass. Like this is far superior than the information that you get within the tool itself. Like the GitHub information actually has like dedicated user guides, example usages, tutorials, that kind of thing. So, someone's really done the hard yards on documenting all of this stuff up. And so, yeah, I recommend actually jumping on there, having a quick read, because it'll give you a much better idea of what you actually can do with this tool. And then in the middle there, we've got all the different subcommands that exist. So we'll talk about those as well. But before that, I just want to quickly mention the mass configuration file. Now, this is something that I don't think is as well understood by people who actually use a mass or know what a mass does. Out of the box, a mass will provide a good amount of functionality. Like you will find results, and it will tell you assets as well. Like, you'll get a network map out of it, but really you can actually unlock way more functionality and get a much better improved results if you go into the configuration file and start changing things in there. So this might be modifying the scope to sort of really hone in on what you're looking at. But probably more crucially, there's a section within the configuration file where you can configure API keys for the various data sources that are integrated natively into a mass. So I think there's currently over 55 different data sources that are integrated into a mass. And you can actually go in there and configure your API keys. And then once you've done your API keys, a mass will actually be able to use those different data sources and find more results. So this is what the configuration file just looks like. Now I haven't got my API keys in here because I didn't want to expose myself like that. But you can sort of see that for each of these different data sources that exist, you can go in there, sign up for an account. Now, these might be, some are free completely, some are paid, some have that sort of 7-day or 30-day free trial sort of thing going on. But you can actually jump on, register for an account, find the API key, whack that into the configuration file here. And then once that's done, then a mass will actually be able to access that data source during its searching, which will just provide a lot more information and a lot more results as well. So yeah, like I say, there's over 55 of these at the moment. You've got your massive ones like your Shodans, VirusTotals, but there's a whole range of them in now as well. There's Alien Vault Open Thread Exchanges in here, and that's a free one, for example, and that's a really large data source. So I recommend actually doing the legwork up front, registering for a bunch of these different data sources and getting the API keys, because once you actually go to then run the tool from there, you'll just improve the results that you get massively by configuring these API keys. So I really recommend doing that. Does take a little while and it is a bit of a tedious job, but I think it's worth it. So yeah, once you've done that, you're free to start using the tool. So we'll start talking about some of the subcommands. Like I say, these are the different subcommands that exist. We've got Intel, enum, viz, track, and db. So we'll just start top down and I'll talk about each of these subcommands and give some example outputs. The Intel command. Now this is one that is more around open source information gathering, and it's really there to identify new root domains that still belong to the organization that you're investigating. So I've got an example here, owasp.org versus absec.org.nz. Now these are two different root domains that still sit under the larger OWASP organization. But they're different root domains, so it's really kind of giving you that horizontal new target discovery. This is what a command output looks like. So the command that I'm running here is just running a mass, specifying the Intel subcommand. Then I've got -d owasp.org. So this is the domain owasp is like the base search. So it's essentially saying, hey, identify more root domains that still belong to the same organization that the owasp.org root domain belongs to. Giving it the location of the configuration file that we spoke about earlier. And then in this one, I've actually got the -whois flag. That is there to do reverse whois lookups. So what that means is it will take the whois information of owasp.org, and then it'll identify different root domains that have the same or similar whois information and give you those as well, because that is a way that it can say, okay, well, these are probably going to be root domains that also exist in the same organization if the whois records are the same. So that is kind of one example of the active reconnaissance that MS can do in identifying new root domains. So the output root domains we've got here, towards the bottom we've got a bunch of these different AppSec regional ones. So that's cool. Towards the top there are some more interesting ones, like we've got rtf-owasp.org, zerodaylabs.com, and apis17.net. Now these may or may not belong to the OWASP organization. You can sort of see that these are a bit more interesting, and these are the ones you might actually want to start investigating further, maybe do some manual validation to make sure that they do belong to the OWASP organization, but they definitely jump out as being slightly interesting. Okay, let's talk about the enum command now. This one is really around sort of this is the command that I think is most understood by people who use MS, and this is the command that is going to really give you that network map. So what it does is essentially go through a root domain that you give it and identify all the different subdomains that exist for that root domain. So I've got another couple of examples here. We've got wiki.owasp.org and groups.owasp.org. Now these are two different subdomains that sit underneath that larger owasp.org root domain, but they could be completely different applications with different technology stacks, different IP addresses. They just are subdomains of the same owasp.org root domain, right? So this is what an output for that looks like. It's a pretty similar sort of command to the Intel one. And we've got the enum subcommand, then I'm going -d owasp.org. So this is saying, show me all the different subdomains that exist for owasp.org. You could actually use a list input for this, maybe if you had like multiple root domains that you wanted to identify subdomains for. But in this case, I've just got the single owasp.org domain, and I'm giving it the config file again. And you can see that it just starts to directly within the console give you all the different subdomains that it can identify. So we've got some things like lists.owasp.org, dev.owasp.org, that one could be pretty interesting. Admin.owasp.org, that one could also be pretty interesting, and so on and so forth all the way down. Now at the bottom there, it actually also groups these subdomains identified by the ASN that they sit under. So you can see that most of these subdomains sit under Cloudflare. So that's cool, but there are a few that sit under Amazon directly. So, depending on your organization, if you ran this and you found some subdomains that were sitting in an ASN that was outside of what you expect, then that might be another thing that you go have a look at and say, yeah, hey, why are these subdomains sitting outside of what I expected? So they could be pretty interesting also. I've got the same output here, but I've just specified a couple of different flags. So I've got the -src flag. That is going to, in the output, tell us the source dataset that identified the subdomain. And then I've got the -ip flag, and that is going to show the IP address of the subdomain. Now, the IP address might not necessarily be super accurate, especially if the subdomain is sitting behind a service like Cloudflare. They could be dynamic, but in some cases, you might find static IP addresses, which could be useful information. And the data source, well, that's just kind of for interest, really, just to see like, hey, like which subdomain was identified by what data source. You can see there's a range of different data sources that have identified subdomains here. And AlienVault has actually found a good number of these. And so that kind of highlights the importance again of kind of configuring the API keys with the configuration file, feeding it more data sources, because had I not run the search with the AlienVault Open Thread Exchange API key in there, then there's a chance that I don't actually find this many results, right? So yeah, I think that kind of highlights just how important it is to really do that upfront work to configure the API keys because you're going to get more results from a range of different data sources if you do so. Okay, I just want to quickly talk about the difference between the intel and the enum command. The intel command is for discovery of new root domains. It gives you a horizontal discovery, and it's really for the new target discovery, right? Like find me root domains for the organization that I didn't already know existed. And the enum command is pretty similar. That's really going to find new subdomains for the root domains that you already know exist. And that gives you a bit of a vertical discovery. Now, the horizontal and vertical discovery thing that I'm talking about here, hopefully this will kind of illustrate that a little bit more clearly. So if we think about the network map for the OWASP organization, we've got these root domains that go across the top here, and these go horizontally across the top, right? So we've got owasp.org, appsec.org.nz, and zapproxy.org. And once you've got all these different root domains, the enum command can be used to then take those root domains and go vertically down and identify all the different subdomains that exist for those. So we spoke about the owasp.org subdomains there previously, so I've just got a few different examples in this table here. And then on the zapproxy side, for example, there's things like tell.zapproxy.org and news.zapproxy.org. And then it's the combination of these two that will give you that full network map. So hopefully you can see the intel and enum command do sort of work together, because running both of those will actually give you this full map of all the different assets that exist within an organization. Okay, let's talk just quickly on some of the other three subcommands that exist. So the track command is there and really just tracks the different results that you run over time. So the MAS does have a built-in database, although it can be also configured with a remote database. And each time a search is run using a MAS, those results will be stored within this local database. And because they're stored, you can actually compare two different searches, and it'll just spit out the different changes that were made during the time that those two different searches were run. So this is what that kind of looks like now. I ran these two searches not too like far apart from each other. I think maybe just like a few days kind of thing. So you can see in this example that like it's just identified that some IP addresses have been changed and moved around. Because these are sitting behind Cloudflare, that doesn't really tell you too much. But if a new subdomain were to be identified or had been put online and found by a MAS, that would be added on here. Or maybe if a subdomain had been removed, that would be added on here as well. So if you run a MAS kind of regularly, maybe say every month or every few months, the track command can be pretty useful because it's just going to tell you what changes are being made each time you run a MAS. So it's pretty useful to sort of track those changes without having to sort of manually take the output of two different searches and compare them in Excel or whatever. Like, it can just tell you, oh, these are what changed, which is pretty useful. The DB command, now I mentioned that a MAS has a built-in database where it stores the results, so you can actually use the DB command to just directly pull the results of previous searches. This is sort of what that looks like quickly. So if I just do the specify the DB command, the domain is owasp.org, and I'm using -list, that is just going to spit out all the different times I've run a search on the owasp.org domain. So I've run 5 different searches for it, and that's, they're all sitting there. And from there, I can actually just choose one of those searches specifically and say, hey, give me the output that was in this search, and that will then just return you the same results. So this is like kind of useful maybe if you kind of remember, oh, I remember seeing like an interesting subdomain maybe a couple months ago. You can actually just have a quick look at the output that you got a couple months ago, and that's all like doable natively within a MAS. So there's some really nice features in terms of using a MAS on an ongoing basis rather than just like a one-off thing. I'll talk a little bit about why I think it's important to be doing this more continually rather than just one and done sort of thing. Finally, there's the viz command. I haven't got as much experience using this one, but essentially this is the way that a MAS does native visualizations for the results that you get out of a search. This is what that might look like. So this is a visualization for the OWASP searches. So the big red circle in the middle, that is the owasp.org domain. And these green circles are the subdomains that have been identified. So You can see that this one in particular is kind of like off to the right, like to the right-hand side by itself. That is secureflag.owasp.org. Now that could be potentially because it's sitting under a different ASN maybe. So that's kind of interesting, just being able to visualize that and see sort of how these are all being grouped together. And you might be able to get some information that way rather than just trying to sort of like manually go through all the results and look for stuff that is interesting. The visualization tool can actually start to give you a bit more of a graphical map. Okay, so let's talk about why I think Amass is so useful. Like we've spoken about what it is and how to use it now. But like why should you be using it, right? Well, I spoke a little bit about asset management earlier in this talk. And asset management really is critical for the success of your organization's security program. It's a bit of a cliche at this point to say that sort of like you can't protect what you don't know exists sort of thing now, but I think it does ring true. Like if you don't have a clear view of what is on the internet, then you're going to have a really hard time actually protecting those things, right? And so Amass is a tool that can just straight up do this for you. Like it can tell you what your assets are that are on the internet. And there are like commercial tools or some organizations that can do this as well. But Amass is like open source. That means it's free. And it's a really powerful tool and it can actually be used pretty easily. So there's not a lot of like legwork you need to do. Like there's a pretty low barrier of entry in using this tool. Once you use Amass to kind of identify all the assets that exist, then of course you can actually use that information to start improving your security, right? So doing things like making sure the logs from those assets are onboarded, making sure you have full WAF coverage, making sure all your assets have gone through vulnerability management, have gone through compliance, been pen tested, that kind of thing. And then in particular, if there's assets that you identify that shouldn't be on the internet, you can actually go ahead and start to decommission or take those down. And that's a pretty cool way of actually, reducing your attack surface. And then for red teamers and bug bounty hunters, I think this one's pretty obvious. Like if you have a large scope bug bounty program or a large scope red team engagement, using Amass is a really cool way at the start of your engagement to identify these new subdomains or new root domains that potentially haven't had this level of love from the blue team or the organization that owns it. And that might mean that because they don't have a good logging posture, or they don't have good WAF coverage, or maybe they're just really old in general. There could be a lot of bugs or things that you can exploit to actually get that foothold onto a network. So yeah, for the red teamers and the bug bounty hunters, this one is a pretty cool tool to help identify things that might give you some good wins. Okay, let's talk quickly about an example of how Westpac use Amass. Hopefully this will kind of tie in all of this together. Log4j. Now, I don't want to necessarily spend too long speaking about Log4j. Like, I think this one is almost like old news in the security lifecycle now. But essentially, it was a critical vulnerability that was yeah, sorry, but essentially, this is a vulnerability that was really critical, remotely exploitable, didn't require any authentication, and could result in arbitrary code execution. So, like most security teams around the world, Westpac had to do a bit of a response to this one to make sure we weren't going to be vulnerable or popped by this. Um, So I talked about, organizations having assets or stuff on the internet. Westpac is a large and old organization that does have a lot of stuff on the internet. And we had a pretty good understanding of what we did have on the internet, particularly, around the critical applications or the applications that are most used. But we didn't want to leave any stone unturned on this one, right? And because Log4j does affect a huge number of applications, and is so remotely exploitable and easy to do, we wanted to just get a bit more assurance on this one and to really understand, hey, what exactly do we have on the internet, to then start thinking about, okay, we need to protect these things or make sure these things are patched from this vulnerability. Okay, so we turned to Amass to help us with that and sort of answer that question for us, right? So we started by making use of the internal data sources that we had. We had an internal certificate and domain name registration process. So that gave us like a kind of initial list of root domains. From there, we used the Intel command to identify even more root domains that might have existed. And once we had that full list of the root domains, we were able to like use the enum command to, with all those different root domains, to get that full network map and say, hey, these are all the different assets that belong to Westpac that are sitting on the internet right now. Once we had that full list, we could then start testing for vulnerabilities ourselves. We used some like GitHub scanning scripts that were out there. One of the cool things about the community response to this vulnerability was so many resources that were made publicly available for people to use. And we used some like commercial products as well. But we wanted to use the GitHub scanning scripts as well, just to get that full kind of adversary emulation going on, right? Because we were seeing a lot of scanning activity happening in our own logs from various different actors around the world. But by doing the sort of discovery process and then the scanning process ourselves, we were kind of able to like emulate that and sort of see for ourselves what was really going on. So here's a log example for us doing this. So the action on this case is blocked. So that's cool. We had other controls in place. But in the header for the X API version, that's where the log4j exploit string was injected. And in this case, it's just calling back to a burp collaborator instance, which is me sitting there waiting for any callbacks. And we had this scanning across the entire range of different assets that we'd identified. And it was pretty cool to see this in our own logs because we could then verify that the activity we were trying to do was actually working, because we could compare these logs to the logs from like other other scanning or exploitation attempts that weren't us, and say, oh yeah, they look the same. So if it's working, if it's not working for us or it is working for us, then it's going to be the same for whoever else is trying to do this also, right? So we could kind of like take back that control and get a bit more information for ourselves on this one. So this is what that whole thing looks like just from a diagram point of view. So we've got the kind of internal Westpac domain and certification, like certificate registration like process that gave us some root domains, along with Intel that gives us the full list of root domains. Split those through into the enum subcommand that gives us the full list of subdomains or that full network map. And from there, we can then take that full network map, use the log4j scanning scripts, and identify which assets might be vulnerable. I sort of want to talk about the future state of how we can keep using Amass on an ongoing basis, because I think it is important to keep using Amass to sort of make sure you're constantly staying up to date with what assets are going on the internet. So we can use that track function that we talked about to tell us the new ones that are going on the internet. From there, we can make sure that if there is a new asset on the internet, that it's gone through that kind of formal approval process or the compliance process as well. And we can actually have this automated too. So Amass has a pretty powerful scripting engine. So you might be able to like get that working so that we get an alert each time a new asset goes on board, rather than having to like manually run it once a month or something like that. We can have that all automated for us. And then of course, like all the assets that we identify or continue to identify, those need to go through sort of vulnerability management processes, either through another open source tool like Nuclei, or some commercial products that are available also. And then, of course, just making sure that they also are onboarded into the security monitoring and operations processes, so that we're sort of keeping on track with any threats or alerts that we should be investigating on those assets. Okay, so just in quick summary, Amass is an open source tool, does network mapping, does asset discovery, has a range of different data sources that it's integrated with. We talked about the 5 different features of Amass. We talked a little bit about why I think it's so important to be using Amass or thinking about your asset management at the very least, using Amass on like an ongoing basis, and making sure all the assets that you identify are actually being integrated with security operations, rather than just like identifying them and being like, oh, that's cool. Actually taking those and sort of making sure you're aware of what's happening with them. Sweet. So I'm not sure if we have any time for questions, but I hope you enjoyed anyway. Get in touch if you'd like. I'd love to hear from you. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy the rest of the con. Thanks.